model that we have and the value of a regulated market. So what do I mean by that? There's actually a group called the Health Officers Council of British Columbia, which has been talking about this for a long time, and I'll give them credit. And essentially, what they say is that we have social harms that get worse with prohibition. It happened with alcohol prohibition, Al Capone, the corruption, buying off judges and politicians was alluded to earlier. And on the other hand, we could have legalization, where we allowed for advertisement and promotion and normalized the behavior in terms of drug use. It's okay if kids use it, whatever. You just let capitalism take over and allow the promotion of these drugs. And there's actually something in the middle called regulation, where actually the harms can be reduced. And we have examples of that from marijuana, looking internationally, but also with things like cigarettes. So you maybe noticed that when you go into 7-Eleven or a gas station now, you can't actually see cigarettes anymore. Because what happened was people would go to buy a quart of milk or whatever it would be, and then they would see the cigarettes and get triggered. We know that taxation reduces rates of use, outlet density, operating hours. All of these tools can be employed to really influence people's behavior and measurable harms in the community. One of the sad things is that with alcohol, as the big companies have got in and won over politicians, we're having increasing problems with alcohol in BC. So this is some Angus Reid data which I thought I'd share. This was before we launched, and you can see that 90% of British Columbians, this is before we launched, we worked with Angus Reid to design some questions to see what our baseline was. You can see 90% of British Columbians are concerned about gang violence, okay? Well, how many British Columbians want to keep the existing marijuana laws unchanged? It's 12%. Which is quite staggering. You can't really see it there, but that little green sliver is 12%. Can you imagine a circumstance where the laws on the book and the public are so in disagreement? I mean, it's just remarkable. You may be saying to yourself now, well, maybe some people want to make the laws stiffer. And if you actually look at a simple question like the possession of marijuana should lead to a criminal record, you can see that actually the vast majority, almost 80%, disagree with that. So most people are unhappy with the laws as they are and want them changed in a more progressive way. Instituting strict mandatory minimum sentences for marijuana-related crime, including possession of 6 or more marijuana plants. You can see that 56% support that before this notion of taxation and regulation really got going in the media in the last 6 months. It's 39%, I don't know if you can see that, support mandatory minimum sentences. And I'm actually amazed that it's not higher, to be honest. This province with the grow ops, the home invasions, the hydro theft, the gang activity, RCMP officers constantly in the media talking about how we need more money, we need more tools to beat this back at the decay in our society because of it. I can't believe that just 39% support it. Chasing and arresting marijuana producers and sellers is ineffective. We would be better off taxing and regulating adult marijuana use. You can see the numbers there. Well, maybe you can't. It's 70% support, 69% essentially support this. So that's before we even started. I'll just give you a sense, and Dave kind of alluded to this, but the reaction from the editorial boards at various newspapers from this. So as soon as we launched, the Vancouver Sun wrote an extremely supportive editorial, as you can see here. When the 4 former mayors of Vancouver came forward, the province came out in support really clearly. This is from Business in Vancouver, so you wouldn't think that business people would be speaking out on this, but they are. This is the latest one from the Vancouver Sun in the wake of the 4 attorney generals coming forward. The Health Officers Council, which has been alluded to, but essentially, even in the interior, there's about 6 health officers. It's a huge group across BC with other people that are physicians that could be members. There's about 200 of us. They formally endorsed the Stop the Violence BC Coalition. This is from the Globe and Mail, essentially supporting us again in the wake of the 4 Attorney General's letter. Just to give you a sense of where the discussion is at, and I can tell you, even when our elected officials aren't willing to speak in public, I've been in private meetings with probably 60 elected officials, either MPs, MLAs, or mayors. maybe one person I've met who hasn't said, keep going, keep doing this. This is a conversation that's long overdue. So how can you get involved? Certainly, the website is there, stoptheviolencebc.org. We would welcome people to join the coalition and stay involved any way you think you might be able to. If you know a mining executive or you're in a position to be able to support us in some way, to consider a donation. I should mention all the people involved with the coalition are doing so on a volunteer basis, but to be able to, meet with editorial boards and get press releases out and continue this conversation in the media, writing reports is expensive, unfortunately. And then just generally help spread the word. I think there's a real role for people that are concerned about this to ask to meet with city councils, mayors, ask to speak to your MLA or MP on the phone and really let them know that you're behind this effort. So I'll just acknowledge the other people that have been involved, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Evan. Our last speaker before we open the evening for discussion is David Bratzer. David is from Victoria, where he is a police officer. He is a member of a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, where he's a very active member. He's been very interested in this subject for some years now and presents sort of a law enforcement perspective of this issue. So, David?
Thanks. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I'm actually, through Dave Kennedy, I've been trying to get out here for 18 months, I think, to do some public speaking about this issue. I'll just tell you a little bit about my background as a police officer. I've been working in law enforcement since 2003 when I first started as a jail guard. 2005 I got hired as a police officer in Victoria, went to the Justice Institute of BC. At the time I didn't really know a lot about drug policy or cannabis reform. It's not really something that is emphasized at the police academy, I would say. So really coming from a position of ignorance on this issue, and yet wanting to do the right thing in our society. As a police officer, you have these ideals really about reducing crime, protecting life, protecting property, and that was really my focus coming out of the academy. So in 2006, I started in patrol. I spent a couple of years in patrol, moved to the beat section, the downtown beat section in Victoria, basically walking the beat for 10 hours at a time, doing a lot of street-level drug and alcohol enforcement in the city. And I know, some people probably think that Victoria is where, criminals go to retire, but it's not quite like that. It's a port city, it's a tourist city, it's a political city, it's a university town. So there's a lot going on in that city in terms of crime and disorder at times. And what I found while working, as part of the beat section, is that essentially I would arrest these drug traffickers, and that didn't make the drug trafficking go away. I mean, and if you think about it with other crimes, it doesn't really work that way. Like if you arrest a rapist, then the sexual assaults being committed by that person stop because they're in jail. If you arrest a murderer, then the murders stop. But when I arrested low-level marijuana dealers on a street corner or in a city park where they had really just overtaken the park, it didn't stop the drug trafficking at that park. All it did was create a job opening for another drug trafficker. So I began to think about this. I found an organization called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. I was pretty skeptical at first. As you can imagine, being a police officer, I was really concerned about my career and what would happen. So I sort of followed them quietly for about a year, just to make sure they were a credible group and not a fringe organization. And after about a year, I decided to start speaking publicly for them. So, we have this complex social issue, and the question is, what should we do about it? And this is what not to do, of course. We don't want our politicians, our leaders, our elected officials to stick their head in the sand. We want to have a discussion about this. And, you know, if we start with the goals of the war on drugs, really those goals are to lower the incidence of death, disease, crime, and addiction, right? And those are noble goals, I believe. And the way that the war on drugs wants to accomplish that is by eliminating drugs from our society. Now, LEAP takes a different perspective. We're an international nonprofit educational group. We're made up of current and former law enforcement officers. So some of the people, for example, even just here in BC that are involved with the group, Senator Larry Campbell is a member of our advisory board. He's a former RCMP drug squad member, former mayor of Vancouver. We have people like Justice Ross Lander, who is a retired BC Supreme Court Justice. Individuals like Randy Law in Nanaimo, who is a former federal drug prosecutor. So this is a credible group. We have really been on the front lines of the war on drugs. And so when we speak up and we say that it's failing, we know that from our own personal experiences. And I'll just caution, of course, that, you know, the views that I'm expressing tonight, these are my personal views, and I'm here off duty, and it's probably abundantly clear, but they don't represent the official views of my police department. So these are the goals of LEAP, and I imagine, of Stop the Violence BC as well, to lower the incidence of death, disease, crime, and addiction, except that we want to do that by eliminating the war on drugs. And there's lots of other examples where prohibition has failed in society in Canada and America. And I'll just run through some of those quickly. First of all, alcohol prohibition in British Columbia. You know, we had that in place from 1917 to 1921, and it only took us as a province 4 years to figure out what a foolish idea that was. But interestingly, I mean, what it did do to a region like here in Kelowna with the Okanagan Valley is it devastated your wine industry. So, you know, different provinces throughout Canada implemented prohibition of alcohol in different ways. Of course, there was a blanket prohibition all through the United States, and the effect of that really was simply to devastate the industry here in the Okanagan Valley. And gradually, throughout the 20th century, after alcohol prohibition ended, that came back. And with that came tourism and jobs and economic opportunities. The other speakers have talked about alcohol prohibition in the United States, so I won't go into that too much. Contraception is an interesting one. You know, before 1969 in Canada, it was actually illegal for a pharmacy to advertise the fact that it sold condoms or birth control or anything like that. And I just mentioned that, it's a really interesting one. That consensual adult behavior, the use of the selling of contraception was legalized in 1969, but it just shows how far societal attitudes can change in a relatively short period of time. I don't think a police officer today could imagine using criminal law to arrest a pharmacist for selling birth control. And so the recurring theme here is that this is all consensual adult behavior. And when you ban consensual adult behavior in these different areas, a black market is created and organized crime moves in. We had it with state lotteries in the United States. Quite often, different states in the US in the early 20th century had banned gambling, for example. Well, that didn't make the gambling go away. What ended up happening was that the lottery was actually known as the Numbers, and it was run by the mafia, and they used 12 and 11-year-old kids to run up and down the neighborhood streets, taking payments and giving people their numbers for the week. And then eventually somebody in government realized that they could regulate this activity, take it away from organized crime, and make money off of it for the public good. Prize fighting is another example. And what all of these prohibitions have in common is that they were failed public policies. So Evan has really touched on this already. I won't get into this in too much detail, but just to show you how far the war on drugs in the United States has ramped up. This is 40 years in the United States. The Drug Enforcement Agency, which is kind of their federal drug agency, quadrupled their number of employees. They now have over 11,000 employees. Their budget grew by 31 times. And we saw a proportional increase in terms of their drug arrests. And I'll just touch base on this because I think it's really important to emphasize what the policy of cannabis prohibition does to minority communities around the world. The incarceration rate for African Americans in the United States, they are 13% of the US population. They're 14% of the illegal drug users, but they are 37% of those arrested for drugs. And they are 56% of those who are convicted drug offenders. So they make up 56% of the prison population in different states. In fact, it's gotten so bad now that in the United States, on a per capita basis, you have more African American males incarcerated than you did in South Africa during apartheid. And most of those people who are incarcerated are for non-violent drug offenses like marijuana trafficking. So this is a failed international policy. It's a $320 billion international market, and it has huge impact on other nations, this policy of drug prohibition around the world. I'll just go through a couple of pictures. These are the slums of Rio de Janeiro here in Brazil, where two rival drug gangs were shooting it out in the slums, and they shot down a police helicopter in the process. This is aerial fumigation in Colombia for the coca fields, gun battles in Kingston, in Jamaica. I'll just point out the bumper sticker on the bottom of this police vehicle, which says 1-800-CORRUPT. That is a sign that drug policy is not working in your country when you have to put those bumper stickers on the back of the police vehicles. And the poppy fields of Afghanistan, obviously they produce a lot of marijuana in Afghanistan as well, but over 100 Canadian soldiers died here over the last decade, and for what? At the end of the day, the trafficking continues. And then just coming full circle, of course, this is the Nanaimo Hells Angels clubhouse that was seized as a result of civil forfeiture proceedings by the provincial government, and we have an emergency response team officer standing, he has to disguise his face, basically guarding the clubhouse here in case of some kind of retaliation. So, and this is the drug war in Canada. This is a 2001 number, $500 million spent annually to address illicit drug use. 95% of that goes to supply reduction. And this is a high-ranking member of the RCMP who testified that 80% of organized crime funding is derived from drug trafficking in Canada. And I just include this slide, I'll wrap up here in just a minute, but this is the drug offenses in Canada in 2010. So we had about 108,000 drug-related offenses where police officers arrested or charged somebody for drugs. Possession offenses were 73,000 of that 108,000. So the war on drugs is really a war on drug users. First of all, I think that's very important to note. And of those 73,000 possession offenses, the majority of those were for cannabis. 56,870 were for cannabis. 7,000 were for cocaine, and then 9,000 were for all other drugs combined. So really, I really endorse the efforts of Stop the Violence BC to push for reform in the area of cannabis, because that's really what the war on drugs in Canada is about. This is, I know you're probably all familiar with Bill C-10. Before today, this was an old slide. I actually had Bill S-10 written up here.